No, and I don't think, Rodney, you didn't have anything either, right?
No, I'm just going to roll from my notes. We won't
Perfect.
let technology intrude on us today.
I think that's helpful because people won't be willing to do this if they think they have to do a PowerPoint every time.
Well, thank you, David.
Okay. As you recall, I was hoping you'd read some from Sirach. So maybe we can get started with this. And after this, Forrest, maybe we can take a minute or two to find out about who you are as a person. Like we don't have to go into great detail, but I think we would like to know more about you than many of us do. But here's Sirach, otherwise known as Bin Sirah, maybe 175 to 200 BC. It's I think, a very fine book, worthy of being part of Scripture. See what you think. This is chapter 2. My child, when you come to serve the Lord, prepare yourself for testing. Set your heart right and be steadfast, and do not be impetuous in times of calamity. Cling to him and do not depart, so that your last days may be prosperous. Accept whatever befalls you, and in times of humiliation be patient. For gold is tested in the fire, and those found acceptable in the furnace of humiliation. Trust in him, and he will help you. Make your way straight and hope in him. You who fear the Lord, wait for his mercy. Do not stray, or else you may fall. You who fear the Lord, trust in him, and your reward will not be lost. You who fear the Lord, hope for good things, for lasting joy and mercy. See if I can scroll this down a little bit. Not too far. Consider the generations of old and see, has anyone trusted in the Lord and been disappointed? Or has anyone persevered of the Lord and been forsaken? Or has anyone called upon him and been neglected? The answer to that is yes. At least people have felt neglected, as in when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? So even if we're not neglected, it is possible genuinely and rationally to feel neglected. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. He forgives sins and saves in times of distress. Woe to timid hearts and to slack hands and to the sinner who walks a double path. Woe to the faint-hearted who have no trust. Therefore they will have no shelter. Woe to you who have lost your nerve. What will you do when the Lord's reckoning comes? Those who fear the Lord do not disobey his words, and those who love him keep his ways. Those who fear the Lord seek to please him, and those who love him are filled with his law. Those who fear the Lord prepare their hearts and humble themselves before him. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, but not into the hands of mortals. For equal to his majesty is his mercy, and equal to his words. All right, I think maybe you can see why I love this book. This is just the first of many, many chapters, and I think it's all very rich. Let's begin with prayer. Dear God, thank you again for Zoom and other resources such as it by which we can get together over vast stretches of space around the world. We are thankful for Rodney and his many contributions to us over the years. We are going to hear from him again today, and we are particularly thankful that he suggested, along with others, this topic, because it is turning out to be exceedingly rewarding for me, and I think for others. In Christ's name, amen. All right, I'm going to turn this down and then get back to Rodney. Rodney, tell us anything you want to about yourself.
Oh, I'd like to tell very little about myself. I have been introduced to the class before, but you can tell by the accent that I'm originally from Australia, from Western Australia. Basically, I'm a frustrated sheep shearer trying to find his way home, and with quite a bit of academia along my journey.
Excuse me, Rodney. I don't know if I'm the only one having difficulty hearing you. Could you come a little closer to your
Yes.
microphone, please?
Let's test that out. How about this? Can you hear me here?
Yeah. Okay, good.
I
Thank
can
you.
hear him.
Is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So most significantly here, I spent 20 years as a president within the Adventist Health System, Adventist Health Systems West, where I oversaw the managed care programming for a while, also at the Loma for around 6 years. But that's really my background in Adventist circles here in the United States. Previous to that, I was an adjunct professor at UCLA, and also did graduate degrees at New York University and actually one degree at Loma Linda. And so I've been retired for about 10 years and been on a personal crusade to find God, maybe on different terms than I did it as a young Adventist boy the first time around, which brought me to the sidelines where I sat with most of my friends in agnosticism for a period of time and felt that I'd arrived there through a intellectually dishonest journey in my life, and I needed to get back in to the realm of spirituality and study. And if I'm going to become an atheist and I'm going to become, or an agnostic, I'm going to get there via serious study. That's my journey. That's my interest and attendance in this class.
Okay, so you've had, let me, if I understand correctly, you've had a somewhat diverse career in healthcare in general, but different aspects of healthcare. Am I correct on that?
Yes, my first undergraduate degree was actually in occupational therapy, and then I got an international award to go to Rusk Institute, which was known as the Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine in New York, where I did graduate work there in physical therapy. Subsequently, was a Kellogg Fellow, came to Loma Linda, did a master's degree here in health services, went on to UCLA and did a doctorate there in healthcare economics and in business management, and finished my dissertation at 4 o'clock one afternoon and started with Adventist Health as a director of managed care the next morning.
Wow. What was your dissertation
that was
about?
Kind of the journey. It was looking at a clinical, randomized clinical study at UCLA, where I did an economic analysis, a cost-effective analysis of bone marrow transplantation relative to chemotherapy for patients that were adult patients that were in the first stage of remission, AML patients. So it was about the bone marrow transplantation and the costs and outcomes affected by bone marrow transplantation relative to what was then chemotherapy.
What did you find out?
Ooh, as part of that study there, I also had to look at how society was spending its dollars on healthcare, how it was funding healthcare projects, making decisions on resource allocation, and then also looking at the return in terms of lives saved, morbidity saved, adjusting those lives that were for quality of life, and to see how money was, and to see what the outcomes were. Just in short summary, there was no, I had to divide my data or my outcomes and my findings up into time periods, because people would make different decisions. If you're faced with a potentially lethal decision, younger people are really making a bet, looking at the odds of, okay, if I have a transplantation now, go through all the side effects, I've got about a 30% chance of dying and my life is over. Do I drag out consolidation chemotherapy, maybe hoping that therapeutics will improve in the future, and I want to graduate, or an older person, I want to see my child graduate, I want to go to a wedding, I want to see my grandchildren, so depending upon your age, you would tend to make a different decision, because at that point the tissue matching wasn't that great, and the side effects were very serious, and the probability of dying was very high as you got older. And so that part of it was, there's no clear answer on this. And when it came to how does society generally spend money to save a life or a year of life, or whatever metric you want to choose, it really came down to squeaky wheel, which organization was best connected politically, financially. At that time, certainly anything that had to do with cardiovascular surgery or the heart was getting funded. It was getting funded. If you had a chronic neurological condition, funds were very scarce in those situations. So society is generally fairly fickle when it comes to resource allocation. And so therefore what society does when the funds are limited, because you could argue that funds were always limited, they do this thing that we call cutting. They cut across the board. But cutting to an economist is really irrational. You should be eliminating those things that are less cost effective, less efficient, and focusing on those things that are more efficient. But interesting enough, healthcare doesn't really do that. It's very, very political. And I think we still see that, frankly, played out today. Maybe we've made some improvements, but when I did this 20, 25 years ago, the squeaky wheel and the sexy kind of breakthroughs in technology were attracting private funds, attracting government funds, and the more chronic conditions were sitting out there still crying for money.
Wow. To do a cost-benefit analysis of these issues, when I've been looking at them from an ethical point of view, is very fascinating. We'll have to talk more about that. And I think maybe an overlap would be Pareto optimality as to what efficiency really, really means in a context like this. And I think your work has to do not only with a public policy, but with the denominational priorities and even campus priorities. If one looks at the relative amount that we have invested in therapeutic clinical medicine and the amount that we have invested in prevention, public health, and so forth, it is, in my view, not symmetrical. It's not balanced. If you look at John Harvey Kellogg, he was a very good surgeon, but he was also interested in changing the dietary patterns of the Americans, and that was a more symmetrical combination. I think it seems to me at this moment on our campus it is not as symmetrical as one would hope for. Okay, anybody have a question to Rodney about his life, personal or professional life, that is not too invasive?
I would just like to add to that most of our decisions in healthcare and even in life are based upon the notion of an incremental loss or gain, marginal loss or gain. A lot of people want to compare healthcare and even in their personal lives to the baseline of doing nothing. We Americans don't do nothing. We always do something. So you need to compare things with the best option, and that gets you to prioritization. And it's just fascinating to me how people don't think within that construct and find it really difficult to prioritize around some kind of cost-benefit basis. Anyway,
wow.
Enough of me on that.
Okay, now, just one more question. Unlike many Australians that I know, you did not come through Avondale. Is that correct?
No, I had a couple of years of what you would call college, which was really high school in Australia, and that was my only real exposure to an Adventist environment outside of my home until I started to work for Adventist Health Systems West. So I'm not steeped in Adventist theology or customs or traditions, other than what my parents and my relatives introduced me to when I was very young.
Had your family been Adventist for many generations?
My grandfather and mother on both sides, no, just on one side, were the first. So it really was my father and mother. My mother was a first generation. My father a second generation. So in that sense, I'm kind of a quasi second and third generation Adventist. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, Rodney, I think you and Roger McQuiston and a few others were, where's Roger? I want to see his face here.
I think that Marvin Ponder was the
and
person. I think Roger
Marvin
wants to bow out of this.
Ponder, everybody's agreeing to have participated in this recommendation except for Roger. He's wanted to disavow himself. But thank you for your group. You meet on what, Friday mornings, Wednesday mornings?
Friday morning.
Friday mornings.
Yeah,
Okay.
Friday morning. We took a vote to bring Rodney in. It was 5-2 to let him join.
David, I'm on probation, and I know it.
That's great. That Friday morning session has gone back for, as I've said before, at least 30 years. I'm no longer a part of it because I live in Beaumont, and maybe I would not have been invited to this new iteration of it. But it began, many, many years ago. It began in 1990. How many years ago is that? So quite a few years.
That's
so,
30.
Yeah, thank you for continuing that. Okay, Rodney, thank you for this. I have found it very illuminating and instructive for myself, this series so far, and I'm trusting that others have as well. Today you're going to talk about the Persians and maybe the Greeks. Am I correct?
Well, most of my period that I will cover will be the Hellenic rule period. I need to tap back into the Persians and bring a little bit of that forward. But basically, it's the Hellenization of the Near East and its impact on Judaism. So I want to stay very focused on understanding what the Judaism was in the time of Jesus, the first century of Israel as it was, and how it flowed into the New Testament. So that's kind of my mission and my focus. And therein lies quite a lot of history and significant events, both external on Judaism and internal. And I'm going to pick up on those and highlight through this around 170 years of Hellenic rule.
Okay, here we go. Thank you.
All right, and I've got plenty of material here, and I tend to talk very fast. So, David, don't worry, I won't get to the Jewish revolt today. So we'll do that next week. But I'm going to start to roll through this. Keep in mind a couple of things. That to this point in Mesopotamian history, any description in cuneiform language and in history talks about gods as heroes, and really is where the gods used humans, people, to fight their wars. And then slowly you see this transition whereby the demigods replace the gods, and humans form armies to honor their gods. So there's that kind of background transition going on in ancient Mesopotamian history. Now, just a couple of key points that I want to draw forward to help me segue into the Greek period here is that historians uniformly record Cyrus as being merciful, as being a liberator, and it's the first time I come across the word statesman. And so he was a champion actually of religious liberty, in that all religions that Babylon had conquered, he allowed the people to go home and take the materials. Not only that, is that Cyrus insisted that the Babylonians go find all the idols and the temple structures, or the items that were taken and stolen, and return them back to the Jews, to Israel. But he also did that for the other nations that he conquered. So in my mind, when I think of Cyrus, I think of a champion actually of religious liberty. And for those that might think this is kind of a mythical time, go to the British Museum, and you can see the original Edict of Cyrus in the British Museum. Cyrus never wanted to control the Hebrew people. That's not what he was about. He left them free to choose their high priest and a direction of their religion. So he wasn't an oppressor of the Hebrew people. He was a liberator. He provided an opportunity for the Jews and for their God Yahweh to reconstruct themselves. But significantly here, he brought a close to this period that we call the ancient Near East. No one was more significant in closing that chapter down of history than what Cyrus was. And I'll explain a little bit of that in a minute, but I have to move more to what historians won't cover, and that is religion and mythology. But there's some very interesting things going on at the level of the gods, given that Yahweh was in competition with gods. The Hebrew god Yahweh was in competition with gods. And one of them is that when Cyrus got to Babylon, he immediately looked for the god that was calling the shots in that region, and that god was Marduk. And so he went to Marduk, and it's written in the annals of Cyrus that Marduk reached out his hands, and I took the hands of God. Okay, that tells us, firstly, confirms that there were living gods calling the shots and the players in Mesopotamia. Marduk was a living god, and Cyrus met him and took his hands. And it also indicates that Cyrus recognized who he was, because he was the god that he sought out. And his offsider in this, some say, was his son, was Nabu, the god Nabu, who historians record may have been the so-called smartest man, the brightest man that ever lived. Some say, as I said, it was Marduk's son. But the Bible talks about this line of Nabu, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar. And you can follow this line by reading the exilic and the post-exilic period in the Bible. And I believe that was recently in the lesson pamphlet here. And so subsequently, the temple of Marduk declined after this stage. And that played into the hands of two other gods. It took pressure off Yahweh, the god of the Jews. But there was another Canaanite god, the god of the Canaanite pantheon. He was the Semitic god. And his Akkadian or Semitic name was Sin, S-I-N. The Sumer people who preceded the Akkadians, he gave him the name of Nana. So often historians talk of him as Nana Sin, depending if which word you want to use, which dialect you want to use. And as Forrest said, keep in mind that only about 20,000 exiles returned home. So the diaspora was well underway. And writers also record that those Jews that went back to Jerusalem were seen carrying books. They went back in small groups. When there wasn't books at this time in terms of bound books that we would call them. So they had to be seen carrying their scrolls, which again reinforces the belief and understanding that the Hebrew scribes were very active during this exilic period, in this exile in Babylon. So now I'm going to move down. So in short, there were two real remaining gods here, Yahweh, and the other remaining god was the head of the Canaanite pantheon, who Abraham's parents worked for. His name is known generally as Sin. So now we get down to the Greeks, the Greek era. It's a fascinating period. So I've broken this down into several sections depending upon who the ruler was. And the first ruler is Alexander the Great. And so we're going to address just a 10-year period. That's what he put in here. This is a 20-year-old full general from Macedon, what we call Macedonia today. He crossed the Dardanelles with 15,000 troops, came via Troy, and there's a reason for that. And he defeated Darius III in 3 decisive battles. Then he veered south with his generals, and the first general to mention is Seleucus, who took Syria, and Ptolemy, who took North Africa. And those two Greek generals, experienced generals, will stay in focus for the rest of this session. So Alexander went on to conquer most of the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and down as far as the Indus Valley. So he was definitely king of the Middle East, maybe ruler of the then known world, or certainly king of the ancient world. and his conquest become just a real turning point in the language, culture, and foreign policy of the Near East, and that certainly includes Judaism. But within 10 years, he was able to make some dramatic changes to foreign policy in the area, but within 10 years, he was also dead. And his DNA was extinguished from the Mesopotamian era. But who was Alexander? Well, his father of record is the Macedonian king, Philip III. His mother was Queen Olympus. You see, you got a connection there to being a demigod or a goddess. This is where some of the mystery or mysticism creeps in. So when I use the word, if I use the word mythology here, I don't do it in a derogatory sense. Mythology, I use it in the root sense. It is the same root as the word mystery. So mythology is a mystery yet to be understood. That's the way that I approach this. So I'm not using mythology in any derogatory manner at all. This is also the time that he obviously introduced Greek language, culture, and lifestyle. He was the guy who hired Berossus, who is a well-known and maybe did the seminal work on the history of Mesopotamia. And many of you, if you have studied Mesopotamian or Greek history, you can't step around running into Berossus. But consider this. Alexander was a full general at 18 years old. He'd conquered the then known world at 20 years old. And then he died in Babylon of a high fever within 10 years. And within 10 days, his son was also dead, reportedly or allegedly from a high fever. This is a story that begs some scrutiny. They buried Alexander in Egypt, and as I said, his DNA was removed from the area. Now, the mythology of this, the spiritual side of this, would go something like this. So suspend documented history for a while, because we all know historians can't write and don't write about religion. But some key things to keep in mind here was that he was informed before he left that he was an illegitimate son of the Egyptian god Ra, or Ammon, or Amon, the god that the Egyptians call the unseen. In this region, there were two unseen gods that were given that epitaph. One was Yahweh, was referred to as the great unseen, but Ra in Egypt was also unseen. He disappeared, and where he went was Mesopotamia. But young Alexander at that age was driven to find out who his real father was. And so he came by Troy, where the patron god is Athena. So now you have two female goddesses. And he was advised to wear ram's horn gear, the battle regalia of a deity. Tactically, that was a real master stroke, because no one wanted to really fight him. They were confused when this guy turns up with the Egyptian ram horns, looking like Ra or the son of Ra. Who wanted to fight him? That's part of the reason why he walked through the empire, that region, without a really serious fight. In fact, he was welcomed by many sections, and those were those that believed in Ra and those believed in Marduk. So the soldiers were confused, and many of them refused to fight, particularly down in Egypt. One of these battles was relative ease. In fact, there's no real pushback on Alexander building a new city named Alexander, to honor himself. I haven't come across any evidence of any real pushback on that. But his main interest was also pursuing who his father was and his longevity. So he went looking for the tree of life. He went looking for his father, wanted to know, did he have the longevity of a god, or at least a demigod? The interesting thing was, of course, he never found it, but what he did get was longevity of reputation. This story goes back 2,350 years, and there's not a serious student that hasn't heard of Alexander the Great. So he got immortality, maybe, in the sense of his reputation, but he was gone, dead, in his grave within 10 years. So when he went to Babylon, he was told by the Egyptians, go back to Babylon, because Marduk is the guy that can tell you whether he's your father or not, or whether you are in fact a demigod. He goes back there and finds that Marduk was in his grave. So he died somewhere after the invasion of Cyrus, but he died before Alexander got there. And all that was left was from his ziggurat was dilapidated, poor condition. So the subsequent Persians had no interest in this god Marduk, and all that was left was a glorified grave. So what Alexander did was make a lethal mistake, I think. He declared that he would rebuild the temple, the famous temple there, to Marduk, and dedicate it to him, believing that he may have been his father. The record shows that when he asked who his father was, he got an answer that pleased him. Not a yes, not a no, possibly, maybe, but whatever he heard pleased him. So he was going to dedicate this temple to Marduk. But what he wasn't was reading what was happening on the ground. The era of Marduk and Nebo were over. And so it was the moon god that was ascending in power. The moon god had a lot of power, growing power in that area. And so there is a reasonable argument that on declaration that he was going to support Marduk, that the people and the priests that supported the moon god had him assassinated and assassinated his son within days to make sure that no Egyptian DNA would ever come back into the Mesopotamian area. It's quite an interesting story, isn't it? And the other interesting thing is, on his way to Babylon, this guy Marduk, where did he stop off? In Haran. And what do we know about Haran in the upper Mesopotamian area? That was the ancestral grounds of who? Abraham and Sarah. It was known as Enlilite country in primordial days. And he's sitting up there saying, taunting the other two guys, saying, are you going to have a go at me up here? I'm going to hang out here for a while. He was an interloper. He's never meant to be up there. And then he went to Babylon because that was his best shot at getting Yahweh out of Jerusalem. His goal was Jerusalem, to take Jerusalem and push Yahweh and his people out of there. That was his goal, and he didn't succeed. So this, in many ways, was a power struggle between the gods that existed at that time. So just moving along here is that in that the god's sin remained, he grew in power, the moon god grew in power, and you can easily see the beginnings of the pre-Islamic forces were starting to build along the Euphrates River and down into Saudi Arabia. And you knew that, I think it was Nabonidus, who became the last king with a Nabu name. I think he put a puppet king in there called Belshazzar or something like that. And he took off, he went disappeared. Well, he went down into Saudi Arabia and he was trumping up business and a following for this Semitic god, this god that is referred to as Nana Sin. And therein, that spread around the Mediterranean area, and Islam came out of that many centuries later. So what did Alexander bring to Judaism? Well, he augmented the Greek language, he augmented Greek culture, thinking, religion, trading, lifestyle. And a key thing here that many historians miss is that he granted the Hebrew people the right to Greek citizenship. And so what happened in the diaspora is the people didn't go back. Many of the people didn't go back to Jerusalem, and very soon every major Greek port and city had a substantial Hebrew population. I think, as far as pointed out last week, there were around at this time probably 100,000 Israelis or Judean people in Egypt and around the Nile area, and in Palestine itself. Archaeologists believe there are probably maybe as few as 30,000 of the original children of Israel left. maybe 50,000 at most. You see, the people were gone, and particularly the people in the northern state of Israel, they were gone, they're already spread. And so you've only got this core of traditional Hasidic Orthodox Jews that are left in that Jerusalem area. The other thing that happened in this time was that the state of Judah and the term Judah started to get dropped. As the Greek language spread, the people were referred to as the Yehudim or the Yudin. We've all seen stories of the Holocaust, you know, and the Jews weren't called Jews, you know, they had to wear, they were the Yehudim. And from that word, you extract the word Jews. So in a strict technical sense, a Jew is really only from Judah, or is a Yehudim from that Israel, from that Jerusalem and Judea area. The language is starting to change. So when Alexander died, there were two generals. There were 5 generals that divided up his earth, and they quickly started to squabble between themselves. But the 2 generals that we'll get into focus was Ptolemy from Egypt, and then Seleucus, who was positioned in Syria. And so this gets us to the Ptolemaic or Egyptian Hellenic period, which is going to run for 125 years. So in 301 BC, Judah technically, officially, became part of the kingdom of Egypt and was run by Ptolemy or several Ptolemies out of Egypt. But it became a peaceful time for the Jews and a peaceful opportunity. So what the Ptolemies brought was they were developers and builders, and so they built civic structures and they built harbors, which would become very useful, and not just in the region, but to the Jews later on, and of course to the Romans. And during this time, there was a language called, hopefully Bernard, I get this right, called Koine Greek, and it became the language of trade, or for the language for trade in the world. Now, I'm only going to take a couple more sentences on this particular period, because you get down to 250 or around about that time, the Hebrew Bible gets translated into Greek, and we know that was called the Septuagint. And we also know that we have in our Sabbath school and on this Zoom today, a world scholar. And so how foolish would I be to wade into any kind of discussion or presentation on the Septuagint, because, you know, I'm really hoping, Bernard, that you'll come one day, we'll be able to do that. I want to hear it from you. Now, I'll make a couple of sweeping kind of comments and move on, but there's a presentation here, an opportunity. I'm not trying to manipulate you in any way about the literature of this silent period, which really is a not so silent period. But I just don't feel, in respect to you or anyone else in the class, that I'm going to wade into anything definitive or any detail on the Septuagint at all. And so what I would say this is that these 72 scribes that went to Alexander and translated the Hebrew, the Hebrew into Greek, that book was initially welcomed. When I say book, the scrolls, that message was initially welcomed by the Hebrew people. But later on, at a later time, it would be rejected by the rabbis, a council of rabbis. And frankly, I have not got a good enough reason as to why did the rabbis at a later date reject the Septuagint. And the reasons generally giving is, well, they didn't like the way the Christians were using it. Well, the Christians were very successful with it. We didn't want to promote Christianity, so we're going to withdraw our support from it. But those answers seem a little trite. So Bernard, one day I certainly look to you, and will enjoy hearing you sometime explain that to me. But I can see you're poised and ready to go forward. We want to make a comment now. I don't want to put you on the spot at all. And I don't want to presume anything about what you will share with us, but I want to acknowledge that you're here and you're a scholar in this area, and I personally look forward to hearing from you.
No, I have nothing to say at this stage, but thank you for your kind words.
Okay. Right. So now at this time, there were some Syrian garrisons that were positioned in Syria. And the interesting thing is they seemed to live very peacefully with the Jewish people. So this was a time of relative peace. But what was brewing was Greek leadership was deteriorating. And when it was deteriorating, it was becoming increasingly anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. So there was trouble brewing. And the Egyptian rule ended in 198 BC when Ptolemy V was defeated by Antiochus III.
Okay,
And
just a second, Rodney. So Egypt is defeated in 193 BC. Is that what I just heard?
198 BC.
198 BC. So
Yeah,
I'm
this guy-
interrupting. Let's
Go
pick
ahead.
it up right there in just a second. We will schedule Bernard for at least one or more sessions on the Septuagint directly, and I need to talk with him about that. So we will gain as much as we can from him in a more direct way. So thank you very much. Back to 198 BC.
All right. So at that time, Ptolemy's domain was, he lost Palestine, as it were, and he was pushed back to controlling and managing Egypt only. So that gets us to this Syrian Hellenic or Seleucid period. And that runs for about 33 years, from 198 down to 165, and that's about where I'm going to lead it. So when you hear the expression Seleucid, then it simply means Syrian Greek. It was the era of Syrian Greek rule and oversight. Now, things changed for the Hebrew people here. Jews were not treated well. They were treated very, very harshly in the go forward from this point forward. Now, they were allowed to select their own high priest, which was very important to them, because a high priest position always went to the descendant or a descendant of Aaron. That was the tradition. But this guy decided that the position would be given to the Hellenizing, as in the Greek preference, the Greek party. And a Greek oriented party was emerging here. Later on, another guy came down and actually auctioned off that position. Well, this was not just extremely offensive to the Jewish people, it just caused an uproar. So the Orthodox Jews at that time, they were known as the Hasidics, they were the pre-Pharisees and the scribes. They bitterly resented this break in tradition, because the scribes were traditionalists too. And the farming of this position, the high priest, out to a political power. And so the position could be bought. The position was now political. And that was a real break with tradition since the time of Aaron. So now you've got this Hellenizing party. Well, who were they? They're the pre-Sadducees. These terms will become more clear next week and the following week. So we have pre-Pharisees, the nationalists. Some people might want to think of them as the conservative party. And now you have this liberal party, Hellenizing party, the pre-Sadducees. And they bribed Antiochus to come down and replace the high priest. So there's collusion here. So what you're seeing is the Jewish people, Judaism, fragment upon internal lines and become factionized. And so you've got the Orthodox and the conservatives on one side, and you've got the progressives, the Sadducees forming, and they had the money and they had the power. They were colluding with Greece, they colluded with Rome, and Judaism was being split apart. So then that brings us down to 168, and this really awful dude, evil dude, called Antiochus IV Epiphanes comes on the scene. He comes down to get involved in this squabble, and he brings a really big stick. And by the way, if you have an epiphany, the word epiphanies means God manifest. This was no godly man. This was just one evil ruler. So when you have an epiphany, think of something beautiful, but don't think of Antiochus. So what he came down was that he banned Sabbath keeping and sacrifices, festivals. He mutilated Hebrew Bibles, and the worst thing he probably did was plunder the temple and put an altar to the Greek god Zeus in the section there for the most holy place. And only he allowed only pagan worship and only pagan offerings. And then the people, the Jews, were forced to eat pig food that had been offered to the god Zeus. Some historians say the temple was actually to Neptune. I've read one article that said it was Jupiter. So these were celestial gods. Let's just put it that way. And he also increased taxes because Rome was taxing him, so he needed to pay Rome off. He was surrounded by Rome. But he did this awful thing of auctioning off for money the position of the high priest, which was a real offense to all the Jews. Having said that, some Jews collaborated with this. And this is what led to the Maccabean revolt that we will talk about next week. So we come to the end of this particular period of Hellenic rule, and the Jews were oppressed, they were depressed, they had lost hope, faith was running low, and a revolt was brewing. So I'm just going to summarize here what the inheritance is, which is your chapter 8. And I was not able last week to download Tomasino, so I have not read this. I've cobbled this together from about 10 other articles and books that I've read on this particular era. So what did the Greeks bring before the rebellion? Well, they brought Greek culture and language. They brought a culture that was open, a more open lifestyle, sports, gymnasiums, education, philosophy, and music. Life was sophisticated. It was more human. It was worldly, and to many it was attractive. Now the traditionalists, they pushed back against this lifestyle that to them was ungodly. But polytheism at this stage was everywhere. You know, these were Baal worshippers, and there's several other gods, smaller gods, minor gods in that northern area that they worship. But you start to hear stories of mystery, mysticism, and magic, the world of spirits. It was common in this time. But traditional Judaism always pushed back and fought against and rejected paganism. But they were the Hewidites from Jerusalem. The Greeks also brought literature. They introduced the great literature historians of the time. And also infrastructure. They built ports. They introduced trading, built administrative centers, standards and weights was instituted, measures was instituted, coinage was standardized, language, we talked about that. Greek became the universal language. Most Jews were bilingual, many of them multilingual at this time, and they instituted this thing called the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was constructed to manage civil laws and civil matters. And you know that Jesus ran into them. But they were the ruling council of the time, and they reported to the high priest, and the high priest now reported to the rulers. You see, you got a different line of accountability. And so they obviously augmented education systems were fostered throughout the land. Philosophers, Socrates, Aristotle, others, Plato. I think I might have forgot to mention that Aristotle, that was Alexander the Great, was actually tutored by Aristotle. And so you've got this continuation, and that's what Alexander was deeply committed to, the Hellenization of the area and the people. He believed in it deeply. That was his mission, and that played out for centuries. Now, another big shift, just before I end here, that is really notable, and it became more pronounced in the Hasmonean period and in the Roman period, more defined, and that is Jewish worship became more external and less internal, meaning it moved out of the temple, and temple-focused Judaism was closing rapidly, especially with the Septuagint, and so it became synagogue-focused, and the teachers in the synagogues were rabbis, and the rabbis now had authority to teach. You see, this is a huge shift. Now the religion was amongst the people. You see, this was a grassroots movement away from temple movement. I would say that Zoom may be a grassroots movement away from temple worship too, David. I'll just throw that one out now. I swear it just went through my brain right then. I didn't anticipate having said that, but there is a benefit to grassroots religion and not being bound by big temples and big temple worship, although it does have its place. But two key things here is that two parties emerged, and we'll take those forward next week. There's the pro-Syrian Hellenizing party, the predecessors to the Sadducees, and there's always the Orthodox Jews, the Hasidim, which means the pious ones. They were the predecessors of the Pharisees. One group that avoided becoming political at this time and may became more political later on in the time of Jesus was the scribes, known as the Sopharim. They returned from Babylon with their books and their writings, and their job was to preserve the scripture. But during this time, it's important to note that they started to write administrative laws, and not all Jews followed the same administrative laws. These scribes, though, were committed to define the law, but to try and preserve the law. But it was during this time, probably unwittingly, that once they went pen to paper and started to define the law and interpret the law, you got this big split in Judaism between conservative people and liberal people when it came down to applying the law. And one of my Hebrew friends from his yeshiva education was told that, I think it was when the book of Leviticus was written, was that the Hebrew scribes had over 600 laws that they wanted to ram in there. This was their great opportunity. But there was only some wiser heads and more senior heads that said, no, you're not. These are all the ceremonial laws that you're going to put in here, and you can go and do what you want with the other, but we're not going to put them into a book that we're going to later canonize. And so those conflicts between these two parties really came into display and continue to display into the New Testament. So what did the Greeks get out of this? Well, I would think not much, but what they did get access in Palestine, in the northern areas, was rich in timber and rich in mineral reserves. Judah had nothing. You know, these were except rocky outcrops, granite hills. It was very desolate. Judean area was desolate. And so what happened here was the Greeks tapped into the richer, more resourceful northern part. And those Jews that were up there, those Israelis, they made money. They became wealthy. They became the Sadducees. They do whatever they wanted to do to survive. So they consorted with the people in the area who had power. And the Sadducees were the people of power. But they were compromised. And they traded money to get the Greeks in there. And as we see later, they paid money to have Rome come in and try and settle some of its dispute. The other thing that Syria got was a buffer zone between themselves and Egypt, which was a huge plus. They also got a launching pad in Palestine that they could invade against Egyptian forces if they needed to. That's the end of Rodney for today. So, next week, I want to get into, if I'm still got the podium here, I want to take a look at the Jewish revolt, the Maccabean revolt as it's called, and the subsequent Hasmonean period, what they brought to Judaism, and that will bring us right up onto the cusp of Rome, which would be 63 BC, and very close to the time of Jesus, and then we'll start to get a very good idea and knowledge, not just an idea, very good knowledge as to what kind of Judaism Jesus was born into and raised into and schooled in, and we'll take it from there. But David, I'm just going to pass this back to you. And
all right, thank you. Oh, I'd like to hear from others as well on this. I am particularly struck by the enormous cultural impact of the Greeks. The Persians seem to have had great administrative skill, and the Romans subsequently had great ability as military people, as well as building things all over the place, from Hadrian's Wall all the way down across the Mediterranean and down into Egypt and so forth. But it's the Greeks who were so culturally significant and remain culturally significant. We think of philosophy as coming from the Greeks, the standards of aesthetics coming from the Greeks, and so forth and so on. Why did the Greeks have such a large cultural impact when Alexander himself, who was a student of Aristotle, as you've said, when Alexander himself, again, parenthesis, sending biological specimens back to Aristotle from all over the world, why did the Greeks have such an enormous cultural impact then? And why do they continue to do so now? Anybody, jump in. Peter, you want to jump in here? Bernard, you want to jump in here? Anybody else who wants to share with us from reading about the Greek people and the Greek culture?
Yeah, sure. If I could
Go
just
ahead,
say,
Bernard.
Wait, one second. Let's see, who's first?
Dr. Taylor is.
Okay, Forrest is managing the queue, and he says that Bernard's first and Peter is second.
Okay, and then also other people, if they would just raise their hand in the participant block, it's to the bottom left, and I can kind of make sure who's there. And I see you, John Teal. So, but others, if you would raise your hand, that would be helpful to me. Thank you. Now, Dr. Taylor, to you.
thank you. When you look at the map, it's easy to see that this is the point in time when the focus moved from east to west,
Yes.
and it just followed from there. And everything you've said, Dave, of course, is true about the Greeks. Their emphasis on philosophy and everything else. And Alexander was very intentional what he did. Unfortunately, the one thing that I think did him in was peace. He couldn't deal with it. He was a man of war. And when he had conquered so much, there was nothing left to conquer. But he took poets, historians, all sorts of, he had a vision. He was a man of vision. And he wanted to spread this far and wide, and obviously a lot of egoism, but there was a cultural focus that he maintained all the way through. And just one other thing, if I may, we have talked previously about the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament and the 400 years, which is an enormous period of time. But if we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, ironically, and think of it beyond its context in which it's placed with Moses, there is a vision there of a temple in Jerusalem, of a centralized religion. And at the time of the reforms of Josiah, that was put into practice. The manuscript was found that was found in the temple when it was being restored and repaired from disuse for a long time, and was read to the king. It was, here was a vision which was put into focus, and for the first time, there was a centralized Passover in Jerusalem, but it didn't last. When they returned from captivity, during the intertestamental period, it was the book of Deuteronomy that was the guidebook for how it was set up. And that's the link between the Old Testament and the New Testament.
So say that last line again. That's a new one on me. The book of Deuteronomy is the link between the two testaments. Say more about that.
In terms of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, of course, Genesis to Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy has a vision that is not spoken of in the other books. And it talks about the place that God will choose In terms of the Samaritans, they changed the tense of that. It was the place that they had chosen, Mount Gerizim. And you remember Jesus in the book of John and the chapter 4 and the woman of Samaria and the discussion where the center lay. And in the Samaritan text, after the 10 commandments, there is essentially an 11th commandment, which says that the temple should be built in Jerusalem. So the Hebrew side looks forward to what the future, the Samaritan side, and of course the Samaritans only took those 5 books. They changed the tense and believed that Mount Gerizim had been chosen. So we see the preliminary putting of that into practice at the time of Josiah. And when it came back, Deuteronomy is the guiding text for the setting up of the what now is the state of Israel when they came back from captivity. And it was in that context that Judaism developed. The sects, the centralized worship in Jerusalem. And it has been mentioned, one of the ways to describe this period is the Second Temple period. And it was a completely different focus from what had been there before. And that's the world in which we find Jesus and the New Testament in general, in terms of Jerusalem and the form of worship that was in practice by that time.
Wow, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. So also, I guess part of this is where we find the what we consider the scriptures to be coming together, right? The books that we have are probably the results of editors who polished things up at that time. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, of course, there was a period when books were of the New Testament was canon and the books themselves were thought to be written in the 2nd century BCE, although they need to be far enough ahead of the Septuagint for the Septuagint to be able to make a translation of it. And when I was in graduate school, there was a recognition that much of in fact, in the 9th century or so, the agrarian economy suddenly went literary. It was an amazing event that happened. And the Israelites believed that they could see in the events of history, selected events, that they could see a God who was at work amongst them. And with the recognition of how different this was from everybody else, they started writing it down. They felt this was important for their posterity. And so they began, there was a period, of course, of oral tradition, and then they were written down. And then during the Babylonian captivity, and Ezekiel was the prophet in Babylon, during this time, there was a working and a planning, and Ezra and Nehemiah arose themselves with a vision for what the city would be like when the state would be like when they came back. And it took them time, but they set that out, and they were open to change. And Judaism is built on, but is not a linear extension of the Hebrew Bible.
Wow, thank you. Okay,
Peter,
thank you, Bernard. Is Peter next?
Peter, you're muted. You're gonna get your technician in there.
I'm on now.
I hear
Yes.
you.
What's happened?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Peter.
Hey, well, I don't have image.
Okay, just go ahead.
Okay, well, first, I'd like to mention that I think I have to change my name because here I am listed also as a user. Now, a few observations about, I like to start with a parallel between the way the Assyrians were administering their empire and the Persians, because this is important for the Jews after they return from the Babylonian captivity. The Assyrians were practicing the policy of dislocating the populations of the people that they conquered. And that was for some political reasons, because they want to dislocate these people, to take away their roots, and in this way to stop them from revolting against them. In comparison with, and the recent times, we have Joseph Stalin that was practicing the same policy in the Soviet Union. He was dislocating people from one part of the Soviet Union, moving them to different parts, and also for the same reason, preventing the revolt. The Persians were administering their empire totally different. They were very tolerant with people. And especially they were very tolerant with their religion. And that happened, was very good for the Jews, because they were encouraged by the Persian kings to go back to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild Jerusalem. But from the books of Nehemiah and Nehemiah especially, and Ezra, we learned that they encountered a lot of adversity from these colonies that the Assyrians were bringing, especially in the northern part of Israel. They were opposing the Jews. They didn't want the Jews to get roots again in the place that where they were before. Another observation that I want to make is that, yes, Alexander was educated. His father, Philip II, brought the greatest philosopher of antiquity, Aristotle, as his educator. And Aristotle instilled in him a universal vision, an ambition to strive for the greatest. When he started conquering the Persian Empire, and after he did that, maybe I should mention a little bit the way he did it. Militarily, he was in 3 main battles. He was attacking the center of the Persian army where Darius was located, and then creating confusion in the Persian army, encircled him, creating confusion and winning the battles. After he became the master of the Persian Empire, he wanted to get a unity between the Greeks and the Persians to create a universal empire. One step in this direction was that he married the daughter of the last Persian king. Also, he organized a wedding for 10,000 Greeks and 10,000 Persians. In regard to the influence of Greeks on the Jews, not only the Greek language became kind of, in a way, lingua franca, but also different customs of Greek practice were adopted, especially by the Sadducees that were the Jewish aristocracy. They were building this places for sports, where gymnasiums where they were practicing naked, and they were worshiping basically the human body. And that came in contradiction with the Jewish belief that was against this. Of course, their worship was of one God, Yahweh. Of course, the Greek philosophy was very important. David asked a question, why this Greek philosophy became so persistent, so influential? Well, as we know, historically, the Roman conquers the Greeks, but the Greeks culturally were more advanced than the Romans. They conquered the Romans culturally. Why this happened? Because it was in their roots. The Greeks, Greek society was a society based on the work of slaves. Basically, the Greeks didn't work. They were having a lot of time to philosophize. And they were producing the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, to mention just a few of them. And they were becoming very influential, not only on Jews, but later on Christianity, adopting what was Neo-Platonism that was becoming very influential among them. I will stop here.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. That difference between the Assyrians dislocating and the Persians relocating, that's a very, very important distinction to be made. Now, I have often wondered, I shouldn't say often, I have sometimes wondered what the world would have looked like if Plato, I know this is out of sync time-wise, but what would the world have looked like if Plato, rather than Aristotle, had been Alexander's tutor? And I myself don't know the answer to that, though I think the world would have been different. Is there anybody else, before we turn into the questions, who would like to fill in the historical setting about which we are talking? And also, we need to think forward to the final question I'm going to ask, and that is, so what? How does all of this have any positive impact at all on our lives today? Again, I think that the study of history is inherently worthwhile. So I don't want to depreciate that at all. On the other hand, this is Sabbath school, and maybe we should try to see if there are any benefits beyond the knowledge of history that might apply to our own moral and spiritual lives today. Okay, David, who's next?
David, I'd like to just respond to what you're asking.
Yes.
And not that I have an answer to this at all, but I think the relevancy of this period is that by the time we get to the 1st century CE, the time of Christ, it's a different world than what we find in the pre-exilic Israelite time. And so we have the issue of resurrection. We have issue of the angelology and demons. We have apocalypticism. I'm trying to think of some other issues, but those all seem to have developed during this so-called silent period. But they are different in Jesus' time than they were in pre-exilic times, those issues.
That is helpful. So one practical benefit is that we understand the life and times of Jesus more fully. I think Satanology is another one that occurs. And I think in terms of the problem of evil, the emergence of the idea of Satan is a step forward. It has its own problems, but at least when you have Satan, you don't attribute everything that happens right down to the finest detail solely to God. There's another factor at work here, having an impact on the universe. Okay,
Yeah,
I think that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, we have John Teal who's waiting to talk, and then Jeff or Donna on deck.
I never heard of the story of the Sadducees undermining the priestly order, having paid a bribe. And I wonder if they had any idea of what would be the result of that. Certainly they could not have been pleased to have an altar to Zeus on which pigs were sacrificed. Anyone know more about that? It just seems incredible that they would make such a decision, which was in large part disastrous.
I was struck by that too, John. I didn't realize the Sadducees had collaborated with the Seleucids, I guess, as much as they had. I gathered that they had done so with the Herodians later, and the Romans through the Herodians, but I didn't realize so early they had been collaborators. What? Almost traitors, really. Anybody want to comment on that?
Just that in the records that I wrote is that most all groups were appalled and reviled by this action, except some select Sadducees. So the issue is in any of these kind of power plays is the people that have no power have no power. They can say what they want to say, but they're powerless. You only need to have the leadership, a few people in the leadership that have the power, have the money, have the whatever it takes to cut a deal for these things to happen. And I see it as a product of leadership, Sadducee, pre-Sadducee leadership. And remember that the Israelites in that area, many of them were worshippers of Baal. Baal was a living God. That's one of the things that attracted to them. The Yahwehists in the south, they still had an unseen God. Now, in the north, they had a living God, he had a wife, he even had family members. And you remember the story of Ezekiel, how he, on a clear day, called down fire from God to see who was the dominant God, the stronger God, the more authentic God. But see, Baal had a very, very strong following up there. So many of those Sadducees who lived in the wealthier regions were not necessarily Yahwehists. Their literature, they tend to talk about the Elohim when they talk about their God. Their God, they use words like El and Baal and Lord. You see, these are just a different language that they had when they worshiped. These people, many of them were not Yahwehists. Yahwehists were focused on Yahweh, the God that we Christians access.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rodney.
I have
Who's next for us?
Donna or Jeff up on. I don't know who's going to speak for the family.
I think Peter's already touched on what I was going to emphasize, which was getting back to Dave's question about what was it about the Greeks that took the imagination not only of the people around them, but of all of us down through history, because they were so remarkable in architecture, in science, and medicine, and philosophy.
Too loud.
There's just sort of no area that they didn't touch, it seems. And I mean, you just go around Washington, D.C. and look at the buildings, and you, or anywhere in Europe and many other places, and you see the Greeks. But I'm not sure the Greeks would have had such a long life without the Romans. You know, Rome comes along, and then 800 years they're dominant, and they carry Greece with them wherever they go, and they go a long way. And then, you know, through them, of course, as Peter's already mentioned, to Christianity. And of course, we can't forget the Arabs, who also kind of brought the Greeks back to life after a certain period when at least Greek philosophy and mathematics had faded from social memory for a while. So that's all I was going to say. One of the reasons I think that the Greeks have lasted so long is because they happened to be followed by the Romans, who appreciated their cultural superiority and adopted it and perpetuated it. That's all.
I think that's, when you say that's all, that's a big point, and it's an important point. It may be that without the Romans, we would not know as much about the Greeks as we do. there must be something inherently superior about Greek thought that appealed to people around the world, and that it's not just contingent, but the intrinsic merit of what they were doing is, we can see the intrinsic merit of what they did in architecture, but the same thing would be true in philosophy. Thoughtful people all over the world would probably recognize the excellence of the work they had done. So that's another factor.
Well, I think too, David, that even though Rome conquered Greece, Greek philosophy and religion conquered the Romans. I mean, the Romans just took over the Greek gods, just renamed them, Zeus to Jupiter, and I can't remember all the different, but they took the same pantheon. And the Greeks had a white man's burden, to use a modern, politically incorrect term now, but it was their job to go around and change the world, make the world better for Greece. So they forced Greek culture, but also it was accepted by many automatically.
Yeah, I must say that empires are not totally evil. Sometimes the American empire, if we can call it that way, is thought to be inherently evil by virtue of being an empire. And I think if we look at some of these ancient empires, we see that they did much that was very, very good, as well as many things that were not good. So empires are humanly marked by both goodness and badness, like the rest of us are. But I have here a book by one of the best people at, I can see it's back upside down here, but David Ray Griffin at Claremont has written a book he calls A Systematic Theology for Americans. And for him, the American empire is just evil through and through. And I think that that's far too simple a view of the thing. I notice that the people in India now are wanting the American empire to come closer to them because the pressure China is bringing on the Indians. So, the American empire is bad until you need its help. And then it turns out to be not so bad. And I think that that's true of many, many empires down through history. They have had good as well as bad consequences. Who's Richard Rice?
Oh, no, I've got, wait a minute, before Richard, I've got Elmer Capino, and then I'll get Richard.
Okay, here we go.
Here's my 2 cents. I would imagine the Greeks trumped everyone because the emphasis on Greek was on the individual discovery, whereas before the Greeks, they projected all their powers to gods and somewhere else. But by the time Greek came, the emphasis was on individual responsibility, and that's probably what made it so popular and resonant to everyone.
Wow, okay. So, yeah, the Euthyphro dilemma becomes expanded. So it's not just ethics that becomes shifted from deference to deity to human rationality, but the whole of culture, or the whole of understanding gets to be more and more the responsibility of human beings rather than the reception of human beings. That shift from human reception to human responsibilities is a very important shift. Yeah.
We see
Okay,
that.
Let's let Elmer finish up here.
Oh,
just
yeah,
a second.
go ahead, Elmer.
We see that in the developmental stages of persons. You start from the little kid, and they're more concerned with obedience. But by the time they get to adolescence, they can reason. So it's a natural progression.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, the Enlightenment pushes that even further in the direction of human responsibility for what happens and what humans think both. Yeah, thank you, Elmer.
Richard? Rick Rice?
Thank you. my comment just repeats the last three contributions, but I think we could say that Greeks placed humanity at the center of things. Thales of Miletus is often credited as being the founder of philosophy. He asked the question, what is the one from which many come? And his answer was an answer that makes sense in human terms. He picked, I think it was water, and because water comes in various forms, and solid, liquid, gas. But what was the key about that was that he was appealing to a naturalistic explanation instead of some divine reality. And so that sort of gave rise to the thinking of ultimate reality, or thinking about things in human terms. And I think you could argue that that's sort of the foundation of science. We want our explanations of reality, whatever dimension we're looking at, to make sense within human terms. Another way would be to see that the Greeks humanized the gods. It's interesting, from the years when I traveled with Middle Eastern study tours, we'd go from Egypt to Greece, and lo and behold, the Greek gods looked very much like human beings. In fact, they were idealized human beings. We really don't know what the Greeks looked like, because we doubt that they were as good looking as their statues of the deities, as opposed to the Romans, when they, when they gave their portrait busts, everything is there, wide ears, moles on faces and things like that. The Romans were very unsentimental in the way that they depicted the people that they were portraying. And you can pick out Alexander, for example. I mean, you can pick out Nero in any museum where his face shows, because his ears are right there, the most prominent feature. And the Greeks idealized the humanity. So I think, in a way, our commitment to making things understandable in human terms goes all the way back to the Greeks. And I think the Romans saw the value of that as well, because, as has already been said, there's a sense in which Rome conquered Greece, but then Greek culture took over, and that Hellenized the Roman world. And of course, that was the world within which Christianity arose. And I think the importance of science and saying whatever we believe needs to make sense in terms that are consistent with what we know to be true about the world when it comes to science, creates a very interesting challenge for Christianity and for religion, because there are naturalistic explanations for a great deal about human life, as well as explanations about history that we may have what would you say, a theological predisposition to interpret, and now we've got other ways of looking at it. So I think the importance now that religion has to make sense in terms that are familiar and accessible to thinking human beings, in a way that goes all the way back to the Greeks. We've got to make sense out of the world in human terms. And that's behind so much of the challenge theologically and interpreting the Bible and so forth. So we're all Greek in the sense that we are committed to the importance of rational understanding. So I think we can affirm our heritage. And of course, what's fascinating about the New Testament, I always felt that Paul was the key figure in taking Christianity, which had an origin within the Jewish tradition, into the Hellenistic world, and applying its insights to the larger culture. And it's hard to imagine the history of Christianity without thinking of what Paul did, because he was a Roman citizen. He was Jewish in his background, but he was very Greek in the way that he saw where Christianity should go. And so Paul was a city person. In Greek thought, the city epitomized where human beings could be fully human. That's why Socrates preferred to die in the city than to be exiled permanently when he was condemned to make a choice, one or the other. And the Romans, for example, the very word civilization has at its roots civitas, civitatis, the Latin word for city. And so there's a sense in which we all have become urban people, whether we want to or not. So I think it's fascinating to see how Greek thought has made its way into the Western world generally, behind science, and also in our theological categories. So I'm proud to whatever extent I can claim to have a Greek heritage.
Jan Webb is clapping, I think. Okay.
I have Job. Job, did you want to speak?
He needs to be unmuted.
You're muted.
We need you to Dr. Job. We need you to unmute yourself. One second, Monty. Can you unmute him? There we go.
Anyway, before Alexander went off on his Make Greeks Great Again campaign, the Hellenic people had their own sense of inferiority. The Greeks thought they had stolen everything from the Egyptians, so they were not over super confident. And the Romans were aware that they had stolen things from the Greeks. What is it? Solomon said, "There's nothing new under the sun. We just improved it." I just wanted to make that comment.
Well, that's an important one. But didn't the Greeks change things? If what they got was from the Egyptians, didn't they add their own what, interpretation on all of this?
Oh yeah, their thought was way different, but their art and architecture, there's an evolutionary trend over the years that they kept improving it. And like many things, like kind of watching the grass grow, they were probably not personally aware that they had made these great leaps.
How interesting. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Jeff or Donna again, and then Peter.
And Roger.
Yeah, Donna will be second, okay? I just wanted to point out that as great as Greece was, what happened to Alexander once he conquered Persia? Became Persianized. Robes and all the royal tapestry and everything else. And I think that's because that's what power does to somebody if they don't have a basis.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
I was just going to say that for us, the world began with the Greeks, but there's a lot behind them. I'm not an ancient historian, and so I don't know how much interaction or trade there was with China and the Far East, for instance, before the Greeks, who then were able to take a variety of influences and sort of distill a lot of it into what, for us, the world begins with the Greeks. But I think there was a lot here before. I see Peter wanting to say something.
Yeah, I got Peter on deck here.
Maybe he can respond to that. That's
He's
all.
getting it. He's getting his technician in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donna.
I did it without my technician this time. Thank you. Well, two quick observations I like to make. Somebody raised the problem with that episode that the temple and the altar in Jerusalem was desecrated by Antiochus. Well, the most information about this period, we have it from the Greek, from the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius. He wrote two main books that allow us to know some details about the Jewish history, the antiquities of the Jews and the wars of the Jews. And this episode is described by Antiochus. Also, we should not be surprised that, especially the Sadducees that were the rich aristocracy were cooperating with him. Throughout history, things like that happened. The people conquer people. In their midst were the collaborators with the conquerors. And in most recent times, we have the Queenslings in World War II in Norway. And from here, we have the word collaborator, Queensland. The second thing, I'd like to mention the influence of two great philosophers in the Western civilization. We have, David mentioned a little bit about that. We have on one side Plato and the other Aristotle. Plato in his main book, one of his books, Republic, he is the advocate of the collective leadership, and he's advocating that the best way to lead the city it's emphasizing this cooperation of the community. Well, on the other side, we have Aristotle that was emphasizing the individuality. Aristotle believed that if we have people that very morally solid, they are rich, they are good people, individuals are also making good communities. And we have in this regard, this model, I can say that the American model, it's in some regards Aristotelian model, not Platonic model, because it's emphasizing more individuality. Well, through this, I don't want to say that community is not important, but I like this idea that we have to emphasize the individual first, have good, moral, solid individuals, and they will make also good, solid communities.
You know, I'm sorry, go ahead. I interrupted. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I just want to say that these two important models that were very influential in the Western civilization till our days.
Yes, I agree, and I think that's very timely because so often now we are increasingly viewing people who belong to particular groups as though they are responsible for everything the other members of that group do, and I think that this is regressive. I think that we need to go back to a right kind of individuality and not say, you know, the last term I guess not the last, but the second term I taught, it's a seminar on Western philosophy, and the first paper that one of the students wrote is, what can I learn about anything from dead white guys? That was the way the paper began. And I just think that that's bad. And to be able, you know, to say that, well, this gets to be a little too personal, I think, but there is a increasing tendency to view the members of any group as equally guilty as the other members of the group have done. So I don't think your point about individualism of the right sort is misplaced now. I think it's very, very timely now. Do you want to respond to that, Peter?
Yes, I can add the fact that, as you know, first of all, I want to remind you that I lived for 40 years in a communist-led country. And what is happening today in America is not something new to me. When the communists took over, one of the things that they tried to do, and this didn't happen only in Romania, it happened in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Bloc countries. The first thing that they did, they want to destroy everything that was past, created in the past. This even got a name. This philosophy got a name. It was called prolet cultism. That means the culture or the cult of the proletariat. And according to this, everything that was created by these rich bourgeoisie people was wrong. Should be destroyed, and we have to create a totally new culture. And they started doing that. I mean, the most ridiculous thing happened. If you were caught on the street with an umbrella, you could be arrested because you wear that sign of you are a bourgeoisie of class. And many other very ridiculous things. Well, this stupid thing didn't last very long. After a few years, they started reconsidering this, to use a term that is used today, this white dead people. They're coming back and reconsidering them one by one, one by one. They got a little bit wiser, understanding that you cannot build something totally new if you don't have any rules. Because these were treasures that were accumulated by generations and generations and generations, and you cannot destroy everything that was created in the past and to create something totally new. And this is what some people try to do in America today. Talking about these ridiculous things that it was created by white dead people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Boris, who's next?
Roger, did you want to say something?
I wanted to respond to what David said about the practical application of what Rodney presented this morning. And I got to thinking, Rodney was talking about the Greeks. My mind went to the statue in Daniel 2 and the thighs and I think of belly of bronze, which I understand we interpret that to relate to the Greeks, and then the legs of iron, Rome, and then the feet of iron and clay, the division, and then finally the stone that strikes the image on the feet and absorbs the whole world, which I understand is the second coming of Jesus. Well, when I became a Seventh-day Adventist at the age of 26 and studied with Lee Greer, he spent a lot of time on Daniel 2. And it was because of that picture of history and the future and the second coming of Christ that really was very impressive to me. And I would say it was a big factor in my becoming a Seventh-day Adventist and why I'm here today.
Now, let me make sure I understand. You studied Daniel 2 extensively, and what was it about Daniel 2 that most attracted you?
Well, I think the just the whole concept that here is history leading up to the final event and the seventh, and the second coming of Jesus. That was really the focus of the study. And I think also the position of Rome and the dividing of Rome into the 10 kingdoms, and then the impact that had on the 10 Commandments and the focus of the 10 Commandments, and the Sabbath. I mean, it just, to me, Daniel 2 was kind of the basis of all of that. And so my reflection when Rodney was talking about the Greeks and the bronze came to mind, and the statue came to mind, and came to mind my experience in becoming a Seventh-day Adventist. So that's the personal impact of what Rodney talked about this morning, as far as I was concerned.
So the Daniel 2 sort of situates one in the whole flow of human history. So where one's able to locate oneself where one is now in light of what has happened, and then have some sense of what's in the immediate future. So it's kind of a cosmic location experience that one locates oneself in what we now call the great controversy. Here's where I am in this whole scheme of things, and that gives one's life a sense of a purpose and a meaning that otherwise is more difficult to achieve. Yeah, thank you, Roger. Rodney.
And Forrest, David, can I just insert something?
Yeah, go ahead.
A couple of quick thoughts here. Is that certainly in my reading, I came across where at least some theologians believe that Daniel 8 is addressing Alexander the Great. And so I'm not a theologian. I just want to recognize that some see that linkage there, which is part of the support that the book of Daniel was written very, very late in the compilation of the Bible. But I just want to share my own reading that I'm a little slow actually acknowledging Greek just about anything. They were down in the Middle East for 170 years. They took much, including philosophy, borrowing the gods, mathematics, astronomy, a lot of stuff. That's where civilization was born and was developing. Modern history begins with Greece. And so it's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, well, let's go back to where history begins. Scholars tell us it started with Greece. There's lots of information available on Greece, and Greece launched just about everything. In my experience here, many of the Greek philosophers acknowledge they got some of the information from other sources, but lazy historians don't necessarily go any further. So, but if you read this story from the Persians' point of view, is this area, you're going to get a different story. If you look at archaeology, you'll find that these civilizations up the Euphrates were much more developed than we give them credit for. And if you talk to the Hebrew people, they would write the Hellenic period somewhat differently. Surely the Greeks took something from these godly Hebrews. They say they respected them. What does it mean to respect them? I read often that, oh, we respected the Hebrews and their laws and the way they structured their society, but they don't give them credit for anything much. So from that point of view, there's one author that put out a line that resonates with me, that makes me a little slow to credit the Greeks, is that the Greeks borrowed much and invented little.
Okay, so I hear you saying you're agreeing with Donna Carlson and then Dr. Carlson, Dr. Job, that sure, our history begins with Greece, but there's a lot behind it that we need to be aware of too.
It's the power of authorship, David, and deciding where history begins. And therein you set your sails on a certain course.
Okay. Now, as to the dating of Daniel, one of the things that interested me about our reading from Tomasino this week is that he points out that the ancient Hebrews were not at all adverse to having more than one application to a particular prophecy. So I think that we might say our reading of Daniel 2 in the way that we read it could be construed as yet another one of those legitimate interpretations that would be recognized as such by the people, the biblical people, who did not seem to be overly concerned about being precisely specific. They were willing to have these prophecies work out in many different ways. And it turns out that scheme is pretty remarkable, whether one thinks of it as a forecast or as a recast, right? Daniel 2 could be a forecast, it could be a recast, but either way, it's pretty remarkable. Okay, who's next?
I got Jan. Question?
And then looks like Bud after that.
I was just going to say, this has been fascinating to me. I wanted to go back to your anecdote, Dave, about the Black student who was reacting to studying the history of Western philosophy. And, I wish I'd have had a chance to study the history of Western philosophy. And I'm going to email you to get a book that would be something I could read and listen to and get up to speed on that. But I wanted to see in our university, in the university systems, of the Western world? Do we study the history of Eastern philosophy, African philosophy? You know, so I can kind of see where he was coming from. It's like, well, where do I fit into this picture? You know, my race. So, you know, in this whole movement of Black Lives Matter, they do matter, and I think, you know, all lives matter, but we've kind of left the Black lives out of that. And so I think that's just what I wanted to say.
Well, that's saying a lot. And thank you for saying it. Yes, thank you very much for saying it. I have often wondered what Christianity would look like today had it come to us not through the Greeks, but through Buddhism. What if Christianity had gone around the world the other way and arrived in North America by way of Asia, then by way of Europe? I think Christianity would look a little different today, and in some ways more Hebrew than it does now. Now, in other ways, clearly not. But yeah, we need to. I don't think it's appropriate just to stop studying the Western philosophy tradition, but we should add to that, make our canon, our philosophical canon, much more inclusive than we have. Thank you, Donna.
Okay, I have George.
George. Taiki?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, and then I've got Bud after that.
Yeah, I want to make a brief comment on that sense of feeling the individual. What I'm trying to say is it's very important to have a horizontal.
Somehow I lost George. Did anybody else lose George too?
Yeah, I lost him too.
Yeah.
What can we do?
Years ago, in the sense that, you know, my father, my grandparents, my great, and so on. And what caught my attention was the gentleman saying about the living 40 years in a communist country. Well, it's interesting that my parents left Czechoslovakia in 47 when the communists were already in. And 45 years later, my dad went back at age 87 already. He went back to Czechoslovakia and wanted to visit the cemetery where his parents were and, you know, family and all that. And one son that actually died at the age of 3 years there. And he found out that the communists had destroyed the churches and their records. The records were in those days kept by the churches. And they destroyed the cemeteries that used to be behind, in the back of the churches. So what happens to the feelings, like my feelings, is my life didn't start with the Greeks and with anybody else, but my parents only, not even my grandparents, because I cannot visit a site where they are buried and all that. So it's a different feeling. I don't know how to explain that, but just to call the attention for that feeling that is important to have this horizontal sensation of our lives. And like I have only a vertical sensation of that goes back only one generation. And hopefully we'll go further, you know, further into the future. Just this brief comment. Thank you.
You know, it's a very, very serious thing to erase the memory of a person. You know, to remove the memory of a person is to cause that person to lose his or her identity. And the same thing can happen to a culture. It's a very, very dangerous thing to do. All right, thank you.
I've got Bud now.
Okay, thank you. This is probably not germane to the discussion, but let me proceed anyway. I appreciate Jan's comments with regards to her comment. It makes such good sense. I am always impressed with Rodney Corker's broad perspective. It's just outstanding. we're so fortunate to have Rick Rice present every time he has something to say. It's an amazing thoughts. I appreciate his contributions. Dave Larson, so skillful. I recall the Larson's approach to a great presentation some time ago called Conversation with Authors. That to me was as outstanding as anything that I've ever heard or seen on public television. But I think there's a serendipitous spinoff with regards, in my thinking, in terms of subsequent presentations, David. Donna mentioned one word in her early presentation, Islam. I think that there could be much more said with regards to the Islamic influence. I think of the wise men certainly were from the East, so they were related to Ishmael. And so that's on my mind this morning. To what extent could we better learn from Islam in terms of issues? I'm reminded that when Bill Johnson retired from editorship of the Adventist Review, Paulson pressed him back into service to do two things. Number one, to continue his relationship with the Islam, or with the imams of the world that he had become acquainted with, to continue to develop that relationship. And number two, to better educate the Adventist population with regards to Islam. So I think that whole arena still requires much more thought, in my opinion, as a possible direction for this effort. I'm just so appreciative to be able to listen in on your conversations. I think one other thing comes to mind. It seems that periodically I'm wondering if my friends don't understand the difference between communist socialism and democracy socialism. That's another whole bailiwick of thought that needs to be better understood. Whether or not it's a topic that could be discussed here is another thing, but that's a serious concern of mine anyway. Thank you so much, David, for your leadership. And Rodney, what a guy. When he first came to the Sabbath school class, to be candid with you, I thought, I don't think I can ever be friendly with this guy. As it turned out, he's one of my best friends, and I admire him a great deal. A long ways from shearing sheep to doing what he's doing today, and I'm appreciative. And of course, my good friend Forrest, my buddy Forrest from Michigan, who continues to lead us to believe that Michigan State is far superior to the University of Michigan. And he's so erroneous about that. It makes me wonder what else he has a problem with. Anyway, I love you, Forrest.
Well, thank you, bud. You've blessed us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very
bud.
much for that. If we have time, and if Gerald stays by a little longer, I'd like to see if Gerald would like to say anything about Islam and its importance for us today. And it hooks back to our conversation now, because one of the greats in our history is Aquinas, but Aquinas integrated Aristotle and Paul, really. But the people of Aquinas' time learned about Aristotle again because of the Muslims. It was the Muslims who kept the Greek heritage alive when Europe ostensibly went dark. That's not quite what happened, but then you get the Renaissance coming in with the Islamic people bringing the Greek culture back into conversation. So I'd like to hear from Gerald on that, unless somebody's first before that.
Yeah, I think, Gerald, you can go on.
Well, I have followed the conversation with interest, of course. I guess just a couple of thoughts. One is, having worked in the Eastern cultures, both the Middle East and Asia, I think we still struggle today, particularly as a world church, with and forgive me if this is a bit offensive to put it this way, but the Western hegemony theologically within the church. How do we, and we struggled with this at the General Conference level several years ago. One of the issues we discussed and really didn't come to a good, satisfactory conclusion, I don't think, is how do you take the 27 fundamental beliefs and move them across the world? Can you do that? I remember Cliff Maberly, who was head of the Buddhist Center, saying he gave the statement of beliefs to a Buddhist monk, for example, and the Buddhist monk handed them back after he had read through them just totally blank. He said, "I don't understand a thing of what these statements are saying." So we've followed, as has been mentioned, Rick Rice mentioned it, and others of you have mentioned it, that we have a big debt to the Greek way of thinking. We are Greek in our thinking, but when you start moving our theology across cultures, particularly into Eastern cultures, you're faced with looking again at how do we frame our beliefs and our message in new ways to communicate effectively, and not just communicate effectively, but impact lives within different cultural settings. So that's one observation that I think we are still struggling with. Another one is, it is true that the Islamic world kept Greek thought alive. I mean, they translated the Greek classics. They valued the Greek literature. What's interesting to me, however, is that the dualistic thought, which we inherited from Greeks and which had a huge impact on Christianity, had a lesser impact on Islam. And I've wondered why that is. And the only sad thing that I've come up with is that the strict monotheistic thinking within Islam, which was kept alive within Islam stronger apparently than by Christianity, for example, served somewhat as a barrier against the dualistic thought that so much affected Christianity, and that I think it has affected Islam much less. That's just a second thought on the Greek influence on Islam. So I appreciate the questions that have been raised by others, that maybe we ought to explore the whole area of relationship with other cultures, particularly Islam and others. From my missiological way of thinking, my question is, how do we not just carry our Greek way of thinking in our into our work with Eastern cultures and faith traditions. I wish, and I have hoped down through the years, that somehow Well, I still raise the question: how do we carry a biblical hermeneutic across different cultures? And is there just one way of looking at Scripture, or should we respect other cultural approaches to Scripture? And how do we do that? And I don't have the answers totally for that. I raise the questions and I realize the issues, but I think we have still work to do on that arena. Thanks.
All right, thank you. That sets more of our agenda, doesn't it? I wonder, we haven't heard from Dr. Boscovich.
Yeah,
Do you want to say anything?
he's had his hand up, so he's next.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Danilo.
It strikes me that we owe a lot to many different cultures and historical peoples in the past, even if we're not aware of it. For example, if I just think in terms of mathematics, Egyptians were strong on the base 2 number system. Strangely, we're back using that in machine language these days. Babylonians were strong on a base 60 number system. Interestingly, we still use 60 minutes to an hour, 60 seconds to a minute, 60 seconds to a degree, various things like this. We use generally a base 10 number systems, but we inherited that from the Arabian number system. This wasn't something we invented. Of course, Greeks, we've just been discussing, may have invented nothing, but that's not entirely correct. As far as mathematics is concerned, we have Euclid's axioms, and we have Pythagoras' theorem, and Pythagoras is, of course, well renowned for having described the harmonics in sound. That's where ultimately, through the later periods, we came down to octaves in our musical system, which is very fascinating when you think about all the various background sources. So when we think about the past, there is a danger that we try to rank who is more important as a contributor and who is less important as a contributor. I think there is a danger in that because we think about these things from a prism of winning. And winning does not make sense if we do not know what it is we're trying to win. You see, we first have to think in terms of what is the point of life, what gives life meaning, and how can we be more alive, and how can, as Jesus was saying, how can we be more fully alive? You see, so for example, just to ask a simple question, we have neurons in our brain, some of which have thousands of connections and some of which have fewer connections. So I have a simple question for anybody who's interested. Which of these neurons would you like to lose? And the answer, of course, is none. I want to keep all of them as long as possible, because they all have an important function. So what we really need to learn to appreciate is we need to learn to value everyone. It is not that we're somehow handicapped because we are looking at things from a particular point of view. It is always helpful to see things from one particular point of view. It would be helpful if we could also see it from more different points of view, the more the better. But that does not change the truth. The truth remains the same. Different vantage points may be changed. So we need to have both confidence in the truth and commitment to it, as well as a delight in examining it from different aspects. How do we achieve both of these?
Wow, thank you. Confidence and commitment to the truth while being as inclusive as possible. That's so helpful. And I think a good place to have the second to the last comment. Let's have the last comment be from Rodney.
I really
Wait,
don't
wait a
have.
minute, I did have Bud up here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was Bud
Yeah,
first and then Rodney? We'll have Rodney close up.
I'll let Bud speak, even though he doesn't know a good university when he sees one.
Just another quick quote or statement, comment. And Rodney Corker has emphasized this many times in our Friday morning Zoom. We're so fortunate to have Bernard Taylor in our group. Taylor stands head and shoulders above the common herd. And we need to press him into service. We need to tire him somehow. And Boskovic, Dr. Boskovic, we progress to truth is my final comment. We all progress to truth. And I love
thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
I love you guys. Have a delightful Sabbath.
Okay, Rodney O'Chat.
I just remind us that for the purpose of delivery of a message, we break it down into what we think are coherent pieces that are based upon rulers and civilization and critical events. But the fact is, truth and knowledge is accumulative. As Mr. Bostovic points out, is we get it from many sources, and it travels and it morphs. It's like knowledge is like a river. It's like a stream, and so from the purpose that I'm faced with, I'm presenting things in a very highly structured manner. But the Hellenic period didn't end when the Hellenic rulers went. You know, as it's been pointed out, it went on for several hundred years, and well into the Roman period, those influences. So I would just encourage us all to think about a lot of history is perennial in nature. It's continuous. It accumulates. You know, presentation is truncated, but knowledge is never truncated, really. And so, again, I just appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I've really enjoyed the comments. It's been a very rich time for me. I feel I've learned a lot, and I appreciate you being gracious enough to listen to me for the next couple of weeks.
Well, this has been very rich for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. I like to think of banyan tree philosophy. Those of you who know about banyan trees know that they grow up and they stretch out and they drop down vines, and those vines hook into the ground and create new trunks. And that tree is being nourished by soil very far away from where the tree began. It can go over an acre or so with all these different trunks going down to somewhat different soil. And I should think we should have banyan tree theology, not one trunk like a palm tree, but many trunks like a banyan tree, each one nourishing the whole. Now, next week, we move into the Hasmonean period, the Maccabean revolts, and subsequently to that. And I recommend that you read First Maccabees. I don't think Second Maccabees is as worth your time because it's a little more fancy. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's a little more speculative. I think read First Maccabees. It's a fascinating story. It's quite detailed, but it's very fascinating. I read it this week while down at the beach, and I recommend that you read First Maccabees in the New Revised Standard Version. for next week. And I think that's all for now, unless somebody else has a comment or statement before we call it a day. All right, let's thank you all. This has been very, very rich for me, and thank you all for participating. Let's close with prayer. Dear God, thank you for Rodney, who's brought so much to us. Thank you for all the others who have contributed to this very, very, very rich conversation. Help us to be increasingly respectful, not only of particular people, but of particular cultures, eager to learn what we can from each one. Help us to keep in mind our confidence in truth and our commitment to it. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you, everybody. See you in a week.
Here.